I've got to rotate the screen. So good morning. It's interesting, I'm at Clutha Valley this morning, and so I'm posting this message on the KSL website. It's a bit unusual, isn't it? But there's a message here, and we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew. We've talked a lot this morning about redeeming and standing in the gap for people, and that Jesus is our Redeemer. So that's the background or the backstory to what we're talking about. And so if we look at the Gospel of Matthew, there is some background. And I'll read it to you basically. In chapter 5, it starts with the Sermon on the Mount. And there's lots of teaching and lots of controversial encouragement to be a more godly person that shook the culture of today. Chapter 6 and 7, he carried on with more teachings. And there was a whole network of stories that came together. But in chapter 8, Jesus went out and demonstrated what he was teaching. So he was demonstrating the power, he was demonstrating the love for people, and he was spending himself on behalf of those he cared for. And we want to look at some of those stories. And the stories are, he heals a man with leprosy, he heals a centurion's servant, he heals Peter's mother-in-law, he takes authority over the wind and the waves, and he delivers 2 demonized men from evil spirits. Now that's not a bad day's work, is it? Now I'm not sure I can definitively say it was all in one day. I can tell you it's all in one chapter, so it's possible, but he did have to shift location about 3 times and have a boat ride. He had the boat ride to get away from people for a while, but the issues still kept coming. So I believe that when you preach the word which Jesus had done for those previous chapters, you then demonstrate the preached word with signs and wonders following. If you want a healing ministry, you can't just necessarily start from cold. You need to release faith in the people by preaching the word. And that's what Jesus had done. He had taught the disciples, he taught the listeners, the crowds, and then he started demonstrating to, if you like, affirm the word that he had released. So when Jesus came down the mountainside, and this is verse 1 of chapter 8, and basically he was coming down to help Peter's mother-in-law, because Peter had told him, I want you to visit this lady because she's sick, but he kept getting distracted. Does anyone else have that happen in their life? You want to do something and the phone goes. And then the children want something. And the thing that you want to do gets pushed further and further out. No one has that. I'm getting a few smiles, yes. And so Peter was very patient for a start. I'm not sure he was quite so patient by the end of the day. So anyway, he was coming down the mountainside and large crowds followed him because the crowds want something from Jesus. They were pushing a demand onto him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. What's the man with leprosy declaring? Faith, absolutely he is. He knows that Jesus can do it. Leprosy was much like a death sentence in the day, but it also was a huge stigma in the day. You weren't shaking hands with anybody else once you've got leprosy. You were outside in the dung heap, away from most of the people who were well. If you're willing. Jesus reached out his hand, touched the man. I am willing, be clean. So his skin would be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Now that's a nice story, isn't it? Let's do a conclusion or two from that. And the conclusion, I've just summarised it here. That man with leprosy had 3 things going on. He had an expectation that Jesus would heal him. When we pray for healing and pray for things, are we wishing Jesus would hear us? We're wishing he might do something, and we're not sure whether he'll actually completely do it. Because if you start with that premise, if you wish for not much, you'll get not much. But if you put your dependence on Jesus, regardless of what he does, you are opening the door for Jesus to give the full reward for your prayer. So the expectation was there, the honour, because he knew that Jesus was, if you like, the Son of God, and he had a respect for him as well. So I believe that those three things attract the presence. If we're talking about this morning, how do we attract the presence? How do we have a deeper or more intimate relationship with Jesus? Expectation, honour and respect are part of the key, if you like, to attract the presence and the power of Jesus. Jesus affirmed the man's faith by healing him. I've got the impression, because leprosy was so looked down upon, that he actually had to heal the man's heart as well. Because he saw himself as a victim and as a rejected part of society. So he would be scarred in his emotions, do you think? So he needed healing of his emotions. And I believe there was a connection in his thinking as well. So the disease was seen in that day as a curse. The person was rejected and outcast. And most people had an expectation that it couldn't be cured, you died with the leprosy. But what the man did, he changed his expectation that this isn't forever. This is not beyond Jesus, so he defied the norm. So you go to a doctor, the doctor says you've got cancer. Because you've got cancer, you're going to be very sick. We're going to do all these things to you and then you'll die. If that's what you were told, do you accept that? It may be true, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, I've been talking to a man yesterday who was told that, or words to that effect, and he's chosen to discount those words. He's got into books on the healing power of Jesus. He's been building up his personal faith level, and he's declaring the goodness of God. He believes that the medical people can do stuff, but he's not calling it the C word. He's just saying, I'm sick at the moment, but I'm getting well. Hear the difference. Because his expectation has shifted from what the medical people can say and do into what the Bible says Jesus can do. So he, to his credit, is not bowing down and, if you like, declaring a curse over himself. Now, I'm not sure how he's going in the journey, but I do know that he's in a really good place. What he said to me was, the first day he got that diagnosis, he went into fear and shock, and the enemy spoke words into his mind of doom and gloom, and he had to battle the doom and gloom. He had a breakthrough, and the enemy stopped speaking those words. We have thoughts that come into our mind. They're not our thoughts. They're from the enemy. And this man, by building up his faith, has knocked out the enemy's thoughts. Would that be a useful thing in your life? The discouragement has gone. What do you think down the back?
Yeah, life and death is in the power of the tongue.
Yes. So what we confess is what we will grow. If we're looking at despair and speak it, we'll grow despair. Absolutely. Let's go to verse 5. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Now, centurion was in charge of how many men? 100 men, that's right. So he was a man who controlled and gave the orders. He was a man of status. He would be an officer in their army, calling the shots. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralysed, suffering terribly. Now, let's think about this. The Romans were really nasty to the Jews. They took money off them. If they didn't pay, they beat them up. They took them away, put them in prison. They took the wealth of the land. They didn't have freedom to do what they wanted. The Romans were their enemies, their captors almost. And Jesus' response doesn't say, yeah, right. Doesn't say, go and see your Roman doctors. Go and have a bath in the whatever it is. He said, shall I come and heal him? So he wasn't using, if you like, his antagonism of the culture. He was counterculture. So Jesus will heal anybody because he has a compassionate nature, and his nature is to do good regardless of who you are. So if you're a Roman or a resident of Israel, Jesus was open to heal you if you asked. Jesus hears that request. So he says, "Shall I come?" The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof." That's weird, because he's giving the orders. He could make anything happen in that area because he's a man who gives, if you like, power to cause a lot of things to happen. But he's coming under Jesus' authority. He's a man of authority, but he's coming under what he saw as a greater authority. And the question is, who's the authority in our lives today? We like to say Jesus, but in some areas it may be, in some areas it may not. But the centurion says, "Just say the word, and my servant will be healed." Now that's a declaration of faith, isn't it? It's not like he might be healed or he'll be healed slowly. He's saying he will, because you're Jesus and you can do it. "For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." Then Jesus, dropping down to verse 13, said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done, just as you believed it would." And the servant was healed at that moment. Anyone notice the T's missing? What does that mean? Let's look at what that means. Jesus responded to the Roman because of the authority and was being affirmed by that soldier. So the Roman soldier, it wasn't because he was a soldier who could command Jesus to do what he wanted Jesus to do. He requested in humility. So he dropped down from his pride and his authority to submit to what he considered a higher authority. So the occupying culture was pretty harsh. And so for Jesus to engage him with compassion was unusual. For the soldier to ask Jesus was probably even greater, a shock to the people. If you were a disciple and you'd had some harsh dealings with the Roman soldiers, would you be very happy that Jesus was talking to a Roman soldier? Would you be excited that he would heal the Roman so he could go and do more nasty work? So Jesus is always countercultural. He does things that offend the human flesh, that we think this could happen and we don't like it. Yes?
This centurion soldier must have had been different because he had compassion for his servant. Yes,
that is a good point. He cared about his servant, so therefore there was a soft side to him compared to some of the other soldiers who were really rough. The way they spoke and dealt with people was pretty terrible. But I'm certain that the people watching got a shock what was going on. We just don't realise how unusual this conversation was. That in certain parts of the world, you don't talk to other people. It's almost illegal. Like there's an apartheid type system where these people keep to themselves and you don't go and mess with them or talk with them because you're not allowed. It's socially unclean. But Jesus is above all of those rules. Jesus looks at the heart of the people. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand and the fever left her and she got up and began to wait on him. I would call that an instant healing. Sometimes when we're sick, it takes a day or two to come right. But when you're touched by Jesus, it's dramatic. The touch is enough to create the disease to leave and the wholeness to come back. So she got up and then she began to wait on him. What's that telling me? It's telling me that Peter and his family, they loved Jesus. And for her to want to feel like serve Jesus even when she'd just been sick is telling me they had a pretty special relationship and she wanted to care for Jesus. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with the word and healed all the sick. How many did he heal? All. I mean, Jesus is Jesus. He has the creative power of God residing in him. And so things that are going wrong with people, he spent himself for them. And so I would think it's a pretty big day. He's caring for people and giving out to heal them all. Isaiah prophesied, he took up our infirmities, he healed all our, or bore our diseases. And so that's his job description. Jesus knew his job description and he fulfilled it. So an infirmity is a sickness and a disease. So he was, if you like, the Lord over sickness and disease. So healing, I believe, is a form of redemption. And it's like buying back our health to the original DNA blueprint that God has created for us. And we can see here that Jesus had love for his family, or for Peter's family, and Peter's family had love for Jesus. So when you have love for Jesus, it draws his presence, eh? So the love was flowing both ways, and that attracted the blessing. We'll diverge slightly and give you a Roman history lesson. Anyone heard of Julius Caesar? I believe he was before the time of Jesus. Am I right? Any historians in the room? So there's a story that it's told by at least 6 different people in different sources that Julius Caesar wanted to know what his army was up to. So he thought he'd do it by stealth, and he disguised himself as a poor person in a slave's clothes, hopped in a boat that was being pulled by 12 oarsmen, and went out across the harbour to go round and then come and find what the troops were up to. And they got to the part where there's the hard part where you're meeting the sea coming in, there's like a sandbar, and the boat was spinning around a little bit. So Julius Caesar told them to keep going, to try harder and not give up. And he threw off his disguise and said, I am Caesar. I have authority. You must try harder and you will overcome this, if you like, difficult water that we're crossing. And he said this, be of good courage, men, knowing you carry Caesar and Caesar's fortune. So he's pumping himself up. He's setting himself up for a dunking, really, isn't he? Caesar had authority over the men. He had authority over the empire that was created, but he didn't have any authority over the weather, and they had to turn back because they couldn't push out to sea. And so there was a history that Julius Caesar stood up in his boat and commanded that this would, if you like, be overcome. But he's not Jesus, is he? Because this is what happened to Jesus next. Jesus got into the boat and his disciples followed him. So he's had a big day. He's healed Peter's mother-in-law, the centurion servant, the man with leprosy, and he wants to escape from the people. So they got into a boat and got into the water. That's a way of, you like, having a break. I think he would be relatively tired and he may have gone to sleep straight away, because it tells us that he was asleep in the boat when a furious storm came up on the lake. So the waves swept over the boat, but Jesus was still sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we are going to drown. Now, is that a positive confession? That's a negative confession. If you say that sort of stuff, you're cursing yourself, not a good look. So they are in some sort of bad attitude about their future. Jesus woke up and replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid? You've got me with you." He didn't say that in Scripture, but that was the insinuation. Why are you afraid of only the weather? Then Jesus got up, rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. How does that compare to Julius Caesar? Julius Caesar tried it, but Jesus could do it. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." So they were shocked at the level of authority that Jesus could carry. The disciples were panicking with little faith, and I believe they were actually rude to Jesus. Like, "Don't you care?" That's not very polite to Jesus. But he stopped the storm because I believe the depth of relationship they'd built up over time. They'd been through things together. He had, if you like, a love for these people, but they had a relationship that was solid enough that when they were rude to him, he didn't turn their back on him. Are we like that? We have relationships with people, they have a bad day. They are rude to us. Do we take offence? Sometimes we do. Sometimes we do. But the depth of the relationship will determine how long that lasts and whether you make up. So the depth of relationship with Jesus is important. They received a withdrawal from the deposits of time that they had spent in his company, and so will we. If we spend no time in the company of Jesus, we've got nothing to withdraw. This morning we sang, before we got onto the broadcast, about we stand for Jesus. He's beautiful beyond description. We were just putting a deposit in our relationship with Jesus. Do you agree? We were speaking out with our voices, but our spirits, that we are submitting to Jesus. That's a deposit. We need to do that. Verse 28, when he arrived on the other side of the region, so the storm had been calmed, Jesus has had a rest, and you think like his day could be over. But no, it gets worse. The region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men came out from the tombs and met them. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. In other words, they controlled that whole area because they were so intimidating. And this is what, I'm guessing they sort of ran out to see who dared come into their territory. And I believe they'd said this as a challenge. "What do you want with us, Son of God?" They shouted. "Have you come to torture us before the appointed time?" Now, would men know that? They didn't have the book of Revelation to tell them that, It wasn't written then. So what was telling them that they will be, if you like, controlled or disposed of in the appointed time? And it's the demonic power that was in them. People with demonic power can know stuff, but they just don't have the power of Jesus. Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, speaking through the 2 men, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs." He said to them, "Go." And that's all he said. One word. So they came out of the 2 men, and the demons went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. You can have a whole sermon on each of these stories, And there's a lot of symbolism in this. So why do they go into the pigs? Pigs are unclean. What happened to the pigs? Well, the enemy comes to kill, steal and destroy, so the pigs were destroyed. What's it about water? There's a sense in some cultures that water is cleansing of evil spirits. But did it work? The pigs died. So the spirits need somewhere to live, and Maybe they're thinking they could survive in the water. But anyway, that's another story. The area of the Gadara, which they went to, was originally the home of Israel's, one of the 12 tribes called Gad. You notice the word Gad is the start of Gadara. And it actually means fortune and troop, which is kind of interesting when you compare the story of Julius Caesar's statement in his boat. But the area of Gadara had been taken over by pagan Gentiles. It was an area of the Roman forts close to the Parthian border. It was like the end of their the empire. It's probably close, we're getting close to where we have now Iran, I think. And so legions of Roman troops were there, and they were crisscrossing the area, but they didn't crisscross where the demonic people were, because they had no authority over them. And so these two immensely strong wild men intimidated everyone. And I believe they tried to tell Jesus what to do as well. Can we tell Jesus what to do? Jesus is Jesus. He knows the best thing that we should do. So, even though these men were out of their right mind, they acknowledged who Jesus was and spoke out his name, that you are the Son of God. So if he's the Son of God, he will carry divine power. So there's an acknowledgement of that power that Jesus does by his personality carry. So here we've got a summary of those 5 stories. What attracts the presence of Jesus if we look at these 5 stories? Firstly, with the man with leprosy, expectation, honour and respect. If we have an expectation and we honour Jesus and we respect Jesus and what he's said and done, that will attract his presence. We declare his supreme authority. The Roman centurion did that. We make a declaration out of our mouth. You can do it. You have authority in this area. And the nature of Jesus was to have a compassionate heart. So he loves people. And when he's given love and he's received love back, you built a relationship both ways. So when people say they love Jesus but there's no obvious sign of that, it's something that needs to be worked on. And the disciples had spent time to build the relationship. In this country, in this culture, we don't usually marry people without meeting them first. We spend time getting to know them first, and there's a relationship foundation that's built. So time spent in relationship is the 4th thing. And then there's an acknowledgement that in the spiritual realm, over the demonic and the evil, Jesus has supreme divine power. Do you agree? So what I'm thinking to do is that if you had those 5 characteristics, and if you scored 5 out of 5 for that in each characteristic, you would have a score of 25 in your ability to draw the presence of Jesus, do you think? So I want you to spend just a little bit of time asking Jesus, is there any of those areas that you, in your score, would like to come up? So just do that quietly now.